Mrs. Whitmore, why are you sleeping in the hallway? Megan's voice was barely above a whisper, but at 2:17 in the morning, it sounded louder than the grandfather clock downstairs. I opened my eyes and saw her standing a few feet from the narrow folding cot where I had been sleeping for the past 12 nights. She wore an oversized college sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled into a loose knot, and she was holding an empty water glass. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I pushed myself upright and folded the blanket across my knees. Because you're sleeping in my room, I said. Megan stared at me. Your room? I nodded toward the closed door behind her. That guest room was mine until you moved in. Her face changed immediately. The sleepy confusion disappeared. Caleb told me this was his house. I didn't answer. She glanced toward the staircase, then back at me. He said you were his mother and you were staying here temporarily. That almost made me smile. Temporarily. If you enjoy family betrayal stories, hidden wills, and mothers who finally receive justice, subscribe to EverNest Stories. More powerful stories are coming every day. I had lived in that house for 34 years. My husband, Walter, and I had bought it when Caleb was 8. We had painted the kitchen twice, replaced the roof after a bad spring storm, planted the maple tree beside the driveway, and watched it grow tall enough to shade half the front yard. Walter had died 14 months earlier. Since then, the deed had been in my name alone. Yet somehow, somewhere between grief and trying to keep my family close, I had become temporary in my own home. Mrs. Whitmore, Megan said carefully, are you saying you own this place? I looked toward the master bedroom upstairs. Caleb and Brittany were asleep behind that door. The room Walter and I had shared for more than 3 decades. For 34 years, I said. Megan slowly sat on the edge of the small bench across from my cot. She looked embarrassed, but not for herself. I paid Caleb first month's rent and a security deposit, she said. He had me sign a lease. It lists him as the property owner. Something inside me went very still. Had known Caleb was charging her rent. He had called it a way to help with household expenses. I had never asked how much. I had never seen a lease. And he had certainly never told me he was putting his own name where mine belonged. How much are you paying? I asked. Megan hesitated. $1,500 a month, plus the $1,500 deposit. I looked down at my hands. They were resting calmly on the blanket, the same hands that had signed every property tax check, every insurance renewal, every repair estimate since Walter died. Caleb had never given me $1 from Megan's rent. Not one. I'm sorry, Megan said. I thought you knew. So did I replied, though that wasn't entirely true. I had known something was wrong. I just hadn't wanted to give it a name. First, Caleb and Brittany needed the master bedroom because there were 2 of them. Then they needed extra shelves in the pantry. Then Brittany moved my winter coats out of the hall closet because she needed storage. Each change had been explained as practical, temporary, helpful, family, and every time I had stepped aside because I thought keeping peace mattered more than keeping space. Megan stood and disappeared into the guest room. A moment later she returned carrying her laptop. There's something else you should see, she said. She opened the rental website Caleb had used and turned the screen toward me. There were photographs of my kitchen, my living room, my backyard, even Walter's old reading chair near the fireplace. Then I saw the sentence at the bottom of the listing. Additional room becoming available soon. I read it twice. Megan looked at the cot beneath me. Then she looked toward the stairs. She didn't need to ask whose room Caleb planned to rent next. Neither did I. That sentence stayed with me long after Megan went back to her room. Additional room becoming available soon. I sat on the cot until the sky outside the hallway window began to lighten, trying to understand how I had reached a point where someone else was advertising pieces of my home without even asking me. 6 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Caleb had called on a Sunday afternoon and said he and Brittany were having a difficult stretch financially. Their apartment lease was ending, some unexpected expenses had piled up, and they needed somewhere to stay for a few weeks while they got themselves organized. I remember standing in the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking at the empty chair where Walter used to drink his morning coffee. The house had been painfully quiet since his death. I missed footsteps on the stairs. I missed hearing someone open the refrigerator. I even missed having to wait for the bathroom sink. So when Caleb asked if they could stay for 6 weeks, I said yes before he finished explaining. The first few days almost felt like a gift. Brittany made dinner twice. Caleb replaced the porch light that had been flickering for months. For the first time since Walter died, there were voices in the living room after sunset. I told myself the house felt alive again. Then Caleb suggested that he and Brittany use the master bedroom because they had more clothes and needed the extra closet space. I hesitated, but only for a moment. Sleeping there had been difficult since Walter was gone. His side of the bed still felt too present. I moved into the guest room and told myself it might even be easier. That was the first thing I gave up. After that, the changes came slowly enough that each one seemed too small to argue about. Brittany cleared one pantry shelf for her groceries, then 3. My baking pans were moved to the basement because she needed room for an air fryer and storage containers. Caleb took the second garage remote because he said it was more practical if he could come and go without waking me. My mail started appearing in a basket near the laundry room instead of on the kitchen counter. When I asked why, Brittany smiled and said she was trying to keep the house less cluttered. 6 weeks passed, then 8, then 12. Every time I asked how their plans were coming, Caleb had a reasonable answer. Apartment prices were too high. He wanted to rebuild savings. He was waiting for a better opportunity at work. I never pressed. He was my son. I believed giving him time was what a mother was supposed to do. By the 5th month, Brittany was calling the living room furniture ours when speaking to friends. Caleb started saying things like, "We should repaint the kitchen," or "We need to do something about the backyard." I noticed the words, but I ignored what they meant. Then one afternoon, Caleb mentioned renting out the guest room. I laughed because I thought he was joking. I was standing beside the sink washing a coffee mug. He was leaning against the refrigerator, speaking as casually as if he were suggesting a new cable plan. He said the extra income could help with household expenses. I told him the guest room was where I slept. He said it would only be temporary and that we could figure something out. I said no. Clearly. Calmly. No. 2 days later, I came home from a doctor appointment and found my suitcase beside the hallway wall. My clothes had been packed into 2 plastic storage bins. There was a new lock on the guest room door. Brittany told me a renter had already paid a deposit and would arrive that weekend. She said Caleb had assumed I would understand because family had to make sacrifices. I remember looking at my suitcase and thinking how strange it was that my belongings had been moved with more certainty than I had ever shown in defending them. Caleb unfolded the cot that evening. He placed it in the upstairs hallway and said it would only be for a little while. I believed that too, or at least I tried to. Now, sitting there before sunrise with Megan asleep behind the door that had once been mine, I finally understood the pattern. No one had taken my home from me all at once. They had simply trained me to step aside, one room at a time. The next morning, Megan was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She had made coffee, but she was not drinking it. Her laptop sat open beside the sugar bowl, and the rental page was still on the screen. Caleb and Brittany had left early. Caleb said he had a meeting across town, and Brittany mentioned errands without looking at me. The house felt unusually quiet after the front door closed. Megan waited until we heard Caleb's car pull away before she turned the laptop toward me. "I think you should see the lease," she said. I sat across from her at the kitchen table. Walter and I had bought that table 22 years earlier from a furniture store outside Columbus. There were still faint scratches near my chair from the time Caleb had done his science project there in middle school. Now I was sitting at the same table while a stranger showed me paperwork for a room inside my own house. Megan opened a file and scrolled slowly. The monthly rent was $1,500. The security deposit was another $1,500. Utilities were listed as included. I read each line twice, not because the language was complicated, but because I wanted to be certain I was not misunderstanding what I saw. Then Megan pointed to the section marked property owner. Caleb Whitmore. My son's name stood there as neatly as if it had belonged there all along. "He told me he had inherited the house," Megan said quietly. I looked up. Inherited it from whom? His father. For several seconds, all I could hear was the refrigerator humming behind me. Walter had left the house to me. There had never been any confusion about that. Caleb had been present when the estate attorney explained it. He knew exactly whose name was on the deed. Did he say anything about me? I asked. Megan looked uncomfortable. He said you had lived here for a long time, and that he was letting you stay because you were not ready to move. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. Although the coffee had already gone cold, there was something almost impressive about the simplicity of the story Caleb had created. He had turned ownership into generosity. My house had become his house. My presence had become his kindness. Megan opened her banking application and showed me 3 payments. The deposit, the first month's rent, then the second month's rent, which had gone through 2 days earlier. Every payment had been sent directly to Caleb. Has any of this money gone toward the house? She asked. I thought about the property tax bill I had paid in March, the insurance premium that came automatically from my checking account, the plumber I had hired when the downstairs sink backed up. Not that I know of, I said. Megan closed the banking page, then returned to the rental listing. She scrolled through the photographs. I recognized every angle. The dining room with Walter's walnut cabinet in the background, the kitchen with my blue ceramic bowl on the counter, the backyard taken from the deck where Walter used to grill hamburgers every 4th of July. Someone had photographed my life and turned it into an advertisement. There is another thing, Megan said. She moved the cursor toward the bottom. Under the description of her room was the sentence I had seen the night before. Additional room becoming available soon. But now I noticed something beneath it that I had missed in the dark. Interested renters could request advance information. Megan clicked the link. A small preview appeared. 2nd floor private room. Furnished. Quiet household. Available within 30 days. My throat tightened. There were only 3 bedrooms upstairs. Caleb and Brittany occupied the master bedroom. Megan had the guest room. The 3rd room was Walter's old study, where I had stored family photographs, tax records, and boxes containing 34 years of our marriage. It was the last room in the house that still felt entirely mine. Did Caleb tell you who uses that room now? I asked. Megan shook her head. I stood, carried my cold coffee to the sink, and looked through the window above it. The maple tree Walter and I planted was moving gently in the morning wind. Yesterday I had thought I was losing a bedroom. Now I understood Caleb was not renting a room. He was making plans for the entire house, one locked door at a time. That evening I heard Brittany in the kitchen while I was folding laundry at the dining room table. She was speaking quietly on her phone, the way people do when they believe no one nearby is listening. I was not trying to overhear her. I was matching socks and smoothing one of Walter's old dish towels when I heard my name. Janice does not need this much space anymore, she said. My hand stopped. There was a pause, then Brittany laughed softly. Exactly. Something smaller would be much easier for her. I remained still. The kitchen doorway was only a few feet away, but the wall between us kept me out of sight. We have looked at a couple of senior communities, she continued. Nothing depressing. Nice places. Activities, meals, transportation. She would probably be happier. I stared at the dish towel in my hands. No one had asked whether I was unhappy. No one had asked whether I wanted activities, prepared meals, or transportation. I still drove my own Buick. I bought my own groceries. I paid every bill attached to the house. Yet somewhere beyond that kitchen wall, my future had apparently become a family project. Brittany lowered her voice and I missed several words. Then I heard, once she is settled, everything here becomes much simpler. The sentence landed differently from everything that had come before it. Simpler. I thought about Megan's lease. Caleb's name listed as owner. The 2nd room advertised online. My belongings stacked in plastic bins. The cot upstairs. Suddenly, the pieces no longer felt separate. They fit together too neatly. Brittany came into the dining room a minute later and stopped when she saw me. Oh, I did not know you were in here. Just folding laundry, I said. She smiled quickly and reached for her purse on the chair. I was talking to a friend about her mother. She is looking at retirement communities. That sounds nice, I replied. Brittany watched my face for a second, perhaps checking whether I had heard more than I should have. I gave her nothing. After she went upstairs, I finished folding every towel before I moved. I had spent months reacting to each change as if it were temporary. A shelf, a bedroom, a garage remote, a mailing basket, a cot. That night, I stopped looking at them as inconveniences and started looking at them as evidence. The next morning, before Caleb and Brittany woke up, I went into Walter's study. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the old filing cabinet he had bought years ago. His desk was still arranged almost exactly as he had left it, except for the thin layer of dust I could never quite keep away. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the blue document box where we kept property records. The deed was on top. Beneath it were tax statements, insurance papers, the mortgage payoff, letter, and documents from Walter's estate. I carried everything downstairs and spread it across the kitchen table. My name appeared again and again. Janice Whitmore. Owner. Policyholder. Taxpayer. Beneficiary. Caleb's name appeared nowhere beside mine. I read the deed twice anyway. Then I found the business card tucked inside the estate folder. Richard Sloan. Attorney at law. He had handled Walter's estate and sat across from Caleb and me when the ownership transfer was explained. Caleb had heard every word. I picked up my phone and called the number. Richard answered on the third ring. Janice, it has been a while. Is everything all right? I looked toward the hallway, where my folded blanket was still visible upstairs. I am not sure, I said, but I think my son has been making decisions about my house as if it belongs to him. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then his voice became very calm. Bring me the deed, the lease, and anything else you have. Do not confront anyone yet. I looked down at Walter's name on the old estate papers. For months I had been trying to keep peace in my family. That morning, for the first time, I decided I needed to understand exactly what that peace had been costing me. Richard Sloan's office had not changed much since the afternoon Walter and I sat there to organize our estate papers. The same framed photograph of downtown Columbus hung behind his desk, and the same brass clock ticked quietly beside a shelf of law books. I arrived carrying the blue document box, Megan's lease, printed screenshots of the rental listing, and copies of the payment record she had shown me. Richard did not interrupt while I explained what had happened. He listened until I reached the part about sleeping on the cot in the hallway. Then he removed his glasses and looked at me carefully. Janice, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. Caleb is collecting rent from a room in this property. He represented himself as the owner, and you never gave him written authority to do that. No. Did you give him power of attorney? No. Did you add him to the deed? Never. Richard nodded once and opened the property file. He compared the deed I brought with the estate documents already stored in his records. Walter's share of the house had transferred to me after his death. There was no second owner. There was no hidden amendment. There was no document granting Caleb control. My name stood alone. Richard turned the deed toward me and tapped the ownership section with one finger. This house is yours, Janice. The words should have been obvious. I had known them before I walked through his door. Still, hearing someone else say them made me realize how long I had allowed Caleb and Brittany to make me feel uncertain about something that had never been uncertain at all. Richard picked up Megan's lease next. He read it slowly. This is what concerns me most, he said. Caleb did not merely suggest he was helping manage the property. He identified himself as the property owner. I looked at his name printed beneath the landlord line. It seemed different now. Less like a misunderstanding, more like a decision. Richard asked how the household expenses were being paid. I explained that property taxes came from my checking account, insurance was drafted automatically, and I still paid the utilities. Caleb occasionally bought groceries and had replaced the porch light, but he had never shown me any accounting for Megan's rent. Then keep paying your normal bills exactly as you have been, Richard said. Do not change your routine yet. And do not tell Caleb that you came here. He began making copies of everything. I asked why waiting mattered. Because right now you know part of the story. I would rather know the whole story before anyone has a reason to start changing it. That sentence stayed with me. Richard asked whether Caleb had advertised any other space. I showed him the page describing a second-floor room becoming available within 30 days. His expression tightened. Whose room is that? Walter's old study. I told him about the family photographs, tax files, and personal papers stored there. Then I told him what I had overheard Brittany saying about senior communities. Richard stopped writing. Have you signed anything related to assisted living, transferring the property, managing your finances, or allowing Caleb to act on your behalf? Nothing. Good. If anyone places a document in front of you, do not sign it before I see it. He gave me a folder and asked me to begin keeping copies of every email, advertisement, payment record, and written message connected to the house. Before I left, I paused at his door. Richard, am I overreacting? He looked almost surprised by the question. Janice, someone convinced a paying tenant that you were a temporary guest in a house you own. You are not overreacting by asking why. I drove home with the blue folder on the passenger seat. For the first time in months, I did not feel confused. I felt attentive. And when I pulled into my driveway and saw Caleb standing on the porch as if he had been waiting for me, I understood that staying quiet was no longer the same thing as giving in. Caleb stepped off the porch as I got out of the car. Where have you been, Mom? He asked. His tone sounded casual, but his eyes moved immediately to the blue folder on the passenger seat. I closed the door before he could see it clearly. Running errands, I said. Anything interesting? Not really. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that waited for more. I walked past him and carried the folder inside with my purse resting over it. Brittany was in the kitchen arranging groceries. She asked whether I wanted soup for lunch, as if nothing in the house had changed. I thanked her and went upstairs. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept Richard's advice in mind. Watch. Listen. Do not give anyone a reason to change the story. That evening, Megan knocked lightly on the wall beside my cot. She held her phone in both hands. I got an automatic email from the rental site, she said. Caleb updated the listing. I followed her into the guest room and sat in the chair beside the window. Megan opened the message. The photographs were mostly the same, but the description had changed. The second floor room was no longer described only as available soon. It now had a date. 4 weeks from Saturday. Below that was a sentence I had never seen before. Elderly relative transitioning to assisted living. Quiet home expected after move. I read those words slowly. Is that supposed to mean you? Megan asked. Apparently. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. There was something unsettling about seeing my life described in a rental advertisement, written by someone else. According to Caleb, I was already transitioning. According to Brittany, I would probably be happier. According to the listing, my departure was not a possibility. It was part of the marketing. Megan scrolled farther. There is more. Caleb had added photographs of Walter's study. The desk was visible beneath the window. My family albums were stacked on the lower shelf. One picture showed the framed photograph from our 30th anniversary sitting beside Walter's reading lamp. I had not given anyone permission to enter that room, much less photograph it. The description called it a spacious furnished bedroom with excellent natural light. He must have taken these while you were out, Megan said. I remembered the afternoon 3 weeks earlier when Brittany had insisted that Caleb needed the house quiet because he was making business calls. They had encouraged me to spend the day shopping. At the time, I had thought they were being considerate. Now I wondered how many small kindnesses had simply been ways to move me out of the way. Megan showed me another email. The rental site allowed prospective tenants to request information before the room became available. Caleb had already responded to someone. He wrote that the current occupant would be relocating to a senior community, and that the room would be ready after her belongings were removed. Current occupant. Not mother. Not homeowner. Not Janice. Just an obstacle with belongings that needed to disappear. I can forward all of this to you, Megan said. Please do. She sent the messages while I watched. My phone chimed twice. I saved everything into the folder Richard had told me to create and printed copies the next morning before Caleb woke up. Later that day, I found 2 glossy brochures on the kitchen counter. One was for a senior community about 20 minutes away. The other was nearly 40 miles from my house. Brittany came in and noticed me looking at them. We were only gathering information, she said quickly, for the future. I placed the brochures back exactly where I found them. Of course, I said. She relaxed. That was when I understood how comfortable they had become with my silence. They thought I was waiting for them to decide what happened next. They did not know Megan had forwarded every word. They did not know Richard had copies of the lease. And they certainly did not know that the woman they had already written out of the house was finally keeping records of everything. For the next 3 days I said almost nothing about the house. That seemed to make Caleb more comfortable. At dinner on Thursday he talked about rising grocery prices, utility bills, and how expensive everything had become. Brittany nodded beside him as if they were discussing problems that belonged equally to all of us. I listened while cutting my chicken into small pieces. Then I asked, "If Megan decides to move out, what will you do with her room?" Caleb barely looked up. "We will probably rent it again." "For the same amount?" I asked. He shrugged. "Maybe more. The market is strong." I took a sip of water. "And Walter's study?" The room went quiet for half a second. Brittany reached for the salad bowl. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "What about it?" "I saw you moving some boxes last week. I wondered what you were planning." He glanced at Brittany before answering. "We have been thinking about making better use of the space." "By renting it?" I asked. "Possibly." His voice had changed slightly. Not defensive. Careful. I nodded as though the idea had just occurred to me. Where would my things go? Brittany smiled in that patient way she had begun using with me. "We could put most of it in storage, Janice. You do not need to keep every old paper and photograph inside the house." I looked at her. "And where would I go?" Caleb set down his fork. "Mom, nobody is saying you have to go anywhere tomorrow." "Tomorrow." The word interested me more than the reassurance. "What about next month?" I asked. Brittany answered before he could. "We just think you should consider what makes sense long term. This house is a lot for one person." I looked around the dining room. The chandelier Walter installed himself still hung over the table. The curtains I had chosen 10 years earlier were moving slightly in the air from the vent. "It has not felt like a lot to me," I said. Caleb sighed. "That is not the point. We are trying to make things easier for everyone." "Everyone," I repeated. "Yes. Including Megan?" He frowned. "What does Megan have to do with this?" "Nothing. I was only wondering." Then I smiled and asked Brittany to pass the potatoes. The conversation moved on, but I noticed how quickly they relaxed once I stopped asking questions. That was useful. The next morning, I called Richard from the parking lot outside my bank. I told him exactly what had been said. He asked whether Caleb had mentioned a specific senior community or move date. I said no, but the rental advertisement already promised Walter's study within 4 weeks. Richard told me to keep documenting everything, and said he had finished reviewing the property records. There was still nothing giving Caleb any ownership interest or authority to lease rooms. "I am preparing a written notice," he said. "But before we deliver anything, I want copies of every listing and every payment record Megan can provide." Megan had already agreed. That afternoon, she printed the complete payment history from her bank and forwarded the original lease email, including the message Caleb had sent before she moved in. In it, he described himself as the owner and called me an elderly relative who occupied part of the home temporarily. I read the sentence twice. This time it did not hurt the way it had before. Clarified something. Caleb had not improvised this story after Megan arrived. He had been telling it before she ever walked through my door. That evening, I found Brittany at the kitchen island with the senior living brochure spread in front of her. She covered one page with her hand when I entered. "Planning something?" I asked. "Just looking," she said. I opened the refrigerator and took out the milk. "Good," I replied. "I have been doing some looking too." Brittany stared at me, but I gave her no explanation. For the first time I saw uncertainty cross her face. It was small, barely there, but it told me my silence no longer felt harmless to them. On Sunday afternoon, I set the dining room table the way I had for family dinners when Walter was alive. White plates, cloth napkins, the small glass bowl Brittany always used for salad dressing. Caleb seemed pleased when I told him I wanted everyone to sit down together. He probably thought I had finally accepted whatever future he and Brittany had been arranging for me. Brittany arrived at the table carrying 2 glossy brochures. She placed them beside her plate with the confidence of someone prepared to make a presentation. Megan stayed upstairs until I called her down. The moment she entered, Caleb looked surprised. I thought this was family business, he said. It concerns Megan too, I replied. Before he could ask why, the doorbell rang. Richard Sloane stepped inside carrying a brown leather folder. Caleb's expression changed immediately. Why is Dad's attorney here? He asked. My attorney, I corrected. We sat down without serving dinner. Brittany folded her hands over the brochures. Janice, we were actually hoping to talk about next steps, she began. So was I. I reached beneath my chair and placed the blue folder on the table. First, I took out Megan's lease and slid it toward Caleb. His eyes moved across the first page, then stopped at his own name. You went through her paperwork, he asked. Megan gave it to me. Megan sat very still beside Richard. I placed the rental listing next to the lease. Then the payment records. Then the advertisement for Walter's study. Finally, I placed the deed in the center of the table. Nobody spoke. Caleb leaned forward. Mom, I can explain this. Good, I said. Who told you this house was yours? Brittany looked at him. Caleb glanced at Richard, then back at me. Nobody said it was mine. I was managing things. I touched the lease with one finger. You signed here as property owner. It was easier for the rental arrangement. Easier for whom? He exhaled slowly. You were overwhelmed after Dad died. We were trying to help. I looked at the cot visible through the hallway beyond the dining room. Then why did helping me require telling a stranger that I was temporarily staying in my own home? Caleb opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately. Brittany stepped in. Janice, this is getting blown out of proportion. The rental income helped the household. Richard spoke for the first time. Mrs. Whitmore has been paying the property taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance expenses herself. Brittany's face tightened. Caleb looked down at the documents. I placed the senior living brochure beside them. And this? I asked. You were already advertising Walter's study before I agreed to move anywhere. We were planning ahead, Brittany said. For your safety. You did not ask me what I wanted. Because you always say no to change, Caleb replied. His voice was quieter now. Mom, we were trying to make this house financially useful. I looked around the room Walter and I had paid for over decades. It was already useful. I lived here. That ended the argument more effectively than raising my voice ever could have. Richard opened his folder and placed a formal notice in front of Caleb. He explained calmly that I had revoked any assumption that Caleb could manage, advertise, or lease any portion of the property. Any future arrangement would require my written approval. Caleb stared at the paper. So what happens now? He asked. I looked at him across the same table where I had once helped him with homework. Now, I said, we stop pretending I am the guest here. The house was quieter after Richard left, but it was not peaceful yet. Caleb and Brittany stayed at the table long after Megan went upstairs. Caleb kept looking at the notice in front of him, as if another reading might change what it said. Finally, he asked how much time they had to move. Richard had already explained that everything would be handled properly, with written notice and enough time for them to arrange another place. I repeated that calmly. I was not throwing anyone onto the street. I was simply ending an arrangement that had stopped being temporary months ago. Brittany gathered the senior living brochures and slid them into her purse without looking at me. Caleb said he could not believe I was choosing a house over family. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I am choosing to remain part of my own family instead of becoming someone everyone makes decisions for. He had no reply to that. Over the next few weeks, Caleb and Brittany packed slowly. At first, every box seemed to carry a silent accusation. Then something changed. The house began to reveal itself again. My casserole dishes returned to their shelf. My winter coats came back to the hall closet. The second garage remote appeared on the kitchen counter one morning without explanation. Brittany removed her storage containers from the pantry, leaving empty spaces where my baking supplies had once been. I filled them carefully, one item at a time. Megan worried that she would have to leave immediately, but I told her she had done nothing wrong. She had paid rent in good faith. More importantly, she had asked one simple question when everyone else had learned not to notice what was happening. Richard helped me put a proper rental agreement in place while Megan searched for an apartment closer to her job. She stayed another 6 weeks, paying rent directly to me. When she finally found a place, I returned her full security deposit myself. "You gave me more than a room back," I told her on moving day. She shook her head. "I only asked what I saw." "Sometimes that is enough," I said. Caleb and Brittany moved into an apartment about 15 minutes away. Caleb did not speak to me for several days afterward. Then he called. Our conversation was short and awkward, but it was the first conversation in months where he did not tell me what I needed. He simply asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. I meant it. The night after Megan moved out, I stood in the master bedroom for a long time. Walter's dresser was still against the far wall. Morning light would come through the same curtains we had chosen together years earlier. I had avoided that room because I thought returning to it would make me feel his absence more sharply. Instead, it reminded me that grief and surrender were not the same thing. I made the bed with fresh sheets and placed Walter's photograph on the nightstand. Then I walked back into the hallway. The folding cot was still there. Beside it sat the little table where I had kept a glass of water each night. For 12 nights, I had folded myself into that narrow space because I believed keeping peace required me to become smaller. I removed the blanket, folded it carefully, and carried the cot downstairs to the storage room. Nothing dramatic happened. No one applauded. No one saw me do it. That was what made the moment feel entirely mine. I returned upstairs, switched off the hallway light, and closed my bedroom door. For the first time in 6 months, every room in that house belonged to my choices again. Subscribe to EverNest Stories for more emotional family betrayal stories, inheritance secrets, and mother's justice. And watch the next story on screen now.